Welcome back to the Zeitcast, where we explore intersections of theology and culture, spirituality and culture. This is another one of those episodes I have just been so excited about. Professor Zeke Hernandez, and I'll give your formal bio here in a second, but I'll say to you what I said off air, which is that I would have never dreamed that you would be kind enough, as in demand as I'm sure that you are, to make time to have this conversation the day before the election. That's just extraordinary to me. So thank you so much for being here. It really is humbling to be able to have you on.
Well, that's really kind. It's no big favor. I'm glad to do it. Thank you.
Well, it's a big favor to me because I feel like your book is truth serum. I said before, I kind of just want to hook it up by IV to people. This was literally my experience when I read the book for the first time. It felt like, because I'm still kind of addicted to sugary, toxic sodas. And every once in a while, I'll be like, oh, wait, I think I've gone 3 or 4 days without drinking water. And then when I drink like a lot of water, there's this sense of, oh, my systems are firing. I feel like I'm alert and alive. That's kind of how this book felt for me, like this very cleansing, purifying, the drink of water when you haven't had it for so long. But Zeke Hernandez is associate professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, a thought leader in the areas of global and corporate strategy. He's been awarded, was selected by Poets and Quants as one of the best 40 under 40 business professors in the world. His research has been published in scholarly journals and profiled by media outlets such as NPR, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. And his book, which again, I'm really wanting right now. I'm not going to say this because this might go too far. I almost want to say, if you need a copy of the book, let me know, because I would do anything to get this in people's hands right now. Out of pocket. But The Truth About Immigration, Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers, just a remarkable book. And one of the things I love about this book so much, Professor Hernandez, I'm a fan of the academy. I have a background in theology and all that, but I find so often that the books that have some of the biggest and best ideas just are not written in a way that just regular folks can understand. And I so appreciate that this work that's so carefully researched and, a product with such meticulous thought academically is also written in a way that there's not anybody in my life coming from any field or background that I couldn't give it to, in terms of just feeling like folks will understand it. What a gift to have such an accessible resource that's also so well researched. So thank you for this, for the gift that this book is, especially for the moment that we're in.
Well, thank you. You're almost making me blush. That's high praise. And I'm really glad to hear it in the sense that that's what I was going for.
Yeah.
Thanks and credit be to my editor too, who was very good at helping me take academic speak, which sometimes is a little inaccessible.
Sure.
And really pushing me hard to tell the stories and write things in a way that, you don't need a PhD. And so I'm glad that came across for you. I hope that's true of anyone who listens to this and chooses to read it.
Absolutely. Well, and actually, I would love to be able, this feels like a great segue into my first question, even thinking about your editor and your publisher. So here's a thought experiment, because probably knowing realistically, I don't know how many folks will hear it by then, but I'll rush this episode up as fast as I can, knowing that people have immigration on their minds, going to the polls tomorrow. So hypothetical thought experiment. If you're a publisher, because I know these things take a while, having written a few books, you write a manuscript however many months or a year before it's published. If the publisher called you and they said, hey, we'd love to do a digital special edition, election edition of the book with a new forward that expressly frames, even though I know this is a story that's always going, but specifically frames this narrative in context of this election, and you're writing a new forward for it, off the top of your head, where would you go in terms of grounding this specifically in the decision that folks are making tomorrow?
Yeah, what a great question to start with. In some ways, I wouldn't change anything. Right? In some ways, I wouldn't change anything because the message is the same. And I think that, look, the title is The Truth About Immigration. Truth is a loaded word.
Yeah.
And I used it deliberately. Now, by that, I mean truth in terms of empirical truth. What does the best evidence tell us? And so I think, thankfully, the message about what immigrants do for us is enduring. It's the same whether it's an election year or not. So I wouldn't
Yeah.
change anything in terms of what the core message is. But I think I would perhaps present it with more urgency. I really believe that tomorrow, as we go to the polls, we're at a historic moment that's very, very similar to what happened exactly 100 years ago. In 1924, President Calvin Coolidge signed the National Origins Act into law. It was a law that severely restricted immigration into America. It was the most restrictive law that we have ever passed. And it was a result of a debate and conversation that is remarkably similar to everything we've talked about in the lead up to our votes tomorrow. Okay. And it came on the heels of several years of mass migration. Migration reached about 15% of the US population, which is exactly where we are today. And the fear was that these newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe, so these were, instead of people from, say, England and Germany, these were people that were coming from Italy, Greece, Eastern Europe. They were sort of Russia. They were Catholics. They were Jews. Many of them were also Protestants, but they weren't kind of the original stock. And there was a threat, so to speak, of Asians coming in, although Asians were less common. And all the rhetoric that we're hearing today, right? There was a threat of mass deportation, claims that immigrants were stealing jobs, that they were committing crime, that they were poisoning the genetic makeup of the nation.
Yeah.
I mean, if any of this sounds familiar, it's because we've seen one of our leading candidates say that in the last several months and weeks. And it was all the same message. Right. And we made a decision to severely restrict immigration. We blocked all immigrants from Asia, all of them. We essentially reduced immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe by over 90%, under a lot of the same ideas that we're debating today. And it was a disaster for this country. It was economically and socially very harmful. And it took us many, many decades to recover. Immigrants went from 15% of the population to less than 5% over the next 40 years, which is a massive demographic change. And we're on the brink of making decisions that are going to be just as consequential. So I think the only thing I would say is just increase the urgency of why everybody needs to know the message.
That's such an insightful answer. And thinking about, just the idea that there were versions of eating dogs and cats stories going back that far, that this is not new.
Literally. There was an article, I think, the other day that I saw in like the Pittsburgh Gazette or something like this, which is literally about, I believe, Italian immigrants eating dogs and cats. Like you can't, right? You can't script that. I mean, it's the same things coming up again and again. But instead of Southern and Eastern Europeans, now it's Asians and Latin Americans, but we're making the same claims. And I find it so interesting because many of the people making those claims now are the descendants of the very immigrants that we wanted to block 100 years ago. Right? They're the descendants of Italians. They're descendants of Eastern European Jews. They're the descendants of Germans, right? Which were still very scary. They were the largest ethnic group, right? We talk about Germans as an ethnic group now. It's kind of quaint. But, this is really what we were afraid of. And of course, isn't it ironic, right, that the descendants of those very same people are many of the ones now saying what we're saying about, about Asians and Latin Americans. It's quite surprising, really.
Deeply ironic and troubling. And I still want to get into the central thesis of the book, even this idea of the way that immigrants and immigration is a net positive for our country. But I'd love to linger here for just a minute in terms of, it so raises the question for me, what is the motive, politically or otherwise, for people to tell these untruths about immigrants and about immigration? Like, why does this recur? How is it helpful for any people group, for any demographic, to continue to peddle these narratives that just simply are not grounded in reality or fact?
Yeah, look, I think this is where private political gain for a group outweighs what's collectively good for most of us, right? And so there's a very strong political incentive, and there always has been. The reason that this anti-immigrant rhetoric is fairly universal, or sorry, universal is not the right word. It's very constant throughout history, is that it's always paid off politically to demonize an outsider group as the one that's at fault for, economic suffering, social unrest, crime, instability, right? It's much easier, instead of taking a hard look at ourselves and being honest for where those problems are coming from,
Yeah.
which often, we have to look in the mirror, right? And we have to be sincere about, maybe we need to, look at ourselves. It's always easier to blame someone else, right? To shift responsibility. And so this is what in the book, I talk about essentially two narratives that we have always told ourselves about immigrants. And the one I just described is the villain narrative, the idea that immigrants are here to steal your job, commit crimes, and undermine your precious cultural heritage. And that message has always mobilized a minority of people, sometimes a very sizable minority, sometimes close to a majority, right? Because again, it's easy to blame the outsider instead of taking a hard look at ourselves. I guess to complete the other side, the other narrative that we tell ourselves is what I call the victim narrative. The idea that immigrants are the poor, huddled masses, right? This is the Statue of Liberty in the United States. Bring me your tired, your poor, huddled masses. And this is an idea that's full of compassion, maybe even nostalgia for old ancestral groups. But it's a little bit of a pity-focused idea that immigrants are going to cost us, right? We have to welcome them because it's the right thing to do, but it's going to be expensive. And so then what happens is, politically speaking, you have this contest between fear and pity. And I don't need to tell you, I don't need to be a political scientist, tell you who wins, right?
Right.
It's going to be fear every time. And so my point is, when you look at the evidence, immigrants don't need your fear, and they certainly don't need your pity. There's a third empirically true possibility, which is that immigrants are net positive contributors to everything that you want, everything that's good for you economically and socially, that makes your community vibrant and prosperous. And so isn't that like a happy message? And thankfully, it's not just happy, it's what the data actually tells us. So I'm also trying to say, look, don't fall prey to these two false narratives. This is a false dichotomy, right? And I'm sure next we're going to get into why and how immigrants are good for us. But I think that would be the headline. Immigrants are good for you. And notice that that's very different than saying immigration is good for immigrants. I'm saying immigration is good for you. It's good for your family. It's good for your neighborhood. It's good for your state. It's good for your country. That's what the data tells us.
I love the framing that you do with the villain victim narrative, because one of the things that, and while I run a lot of these circles now, that can drive me, frankly, kind of bananas about a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning, liberal, progressive kind of folks, is that there is a lot of gravitating towards narrative that love any version of, here are these very poor folks that are kind of underneath our shoe. Here's what you can do to heroically come in and save them in some way. It's a very different message, what you do in the book, in terms of like, oh no, we're talking about folks who are a net positive to every quarter of American life, including economically, which I feel like for a lot of folks, that message in particular would come as a shock. So I would love for you to unpack that a bit in terms of the ways in which that immigrants are a net positive economically and otherwise for our larger society in America.
Yeah, let's get into that. I mean, and now we're right in my wheelhouse, right? Right where I want to take us, because I'm a business professor, so that's what I think about, right? Is what creates economic prosperity. Look, here's the simplest way I can put it, and I always love to use the fingers of my hand, okay? Immigrants bring 5 crucial economic inputs wherever they settle: talent, investment, innovation, consumption, and taxes. Let me say that again: talent, investment, innovation, consumption, and taxes. You want economic growth, you want good jobs, you need those 5 inputs. Okay, whether it's at the community level or at the national level. And so that's what immigrants bring, because immigrants are people. Now, you bring those same 5 things too when you interact with the economy, right?
Sure.
Maybe you don't bring all 5 of them. Maybe you don't bring a ton of all 5 of them. Maybe you bring more of one than the other. But any group of people will bring all 5 of those. Okay, so immigrants do 2 things. One is they bring more of those 5 things, because more people, a new group of people that arrives in your neighborhood, they're bringing more of those 5 things. But also immigrants, because they're different, that is, they have, different talent and skills. They're connected to different investment networks. They're interested in investing in different businesses. They bring different ideas and innovations. They want to consume different goods and services. So not only do they bring more of those 5 things, they bring a greater variety of those 5 things. And so, as we say in the analogy, not only do immigrants grow the economic pie by bringing more, but they make that economic pie more diversified.
Hmm.
And we know from economic research that more diversified, larger economies create prosperity for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Um, Perhaps we should get into any one of those five that you want, but let me stop my answer there, right? The fingers of your hand will always tell you what immigrants bring to your community.
That's so helpful, and I love the five finger that whole exercise, as well as, by the way, the quiz in the book is so helpful, and I'm sure you've had a minute now for that to circulate. I know it's online as well, but just in terms of how quickly I think many of us can come to the conclusion, oh wait, a lot of things that we've been saying, a lot of things we've been hearing are really more based on memes and vague impressions of things we've seen off
Yeah.
the internet, as opposed to actual data. What has been your experience, by the way, in terms of like circulating the quiz, what people respond to? Where are people typically the most surprised
Yeah,
by
yeah.
how different their answers are from facts?
Yeah, very, very good. Yeah, so if any viewers or listeners want to take this quiz, so you could buy the book or you could go to zekehernandez.net and you'll find the quiz there for you to take. And yeah, I think the quiz asks about 10 to 13 really basic questions about immigrants. And I think what's surprising is that even people who think they're very knowledgeable about immigration or have really strong opinions get most of the questions wrong.
Hmm.
So I would say, I'm not going to go question by question because that would be really boring. But if I go back to the five fingers,
Yeah.
there's a few facts that are really surprising. For example, one of the things that people don't realize is, maybe you realize, well, immigrants come and they fill jobs, and so maybe you knew that they bring talent, or if you reason for a second, you realize, well, actually these people come and they don't. So if they take a job, they don't go home and sit on their hands after work. They're actually spending their paycheck, which means that they're consuming goods and services that means that now businesses have to grow and expand. But one of the ones that in this quiz people almost never think of is what I mentioned as the investment effect that immigrants
Hmm.
have, right? And I'll tell you, I'll illustrate it with a really simple story from my home state. I live in Pennsylvania, one of the battleground states. So early last year, I came across a news article that caught my eye, and it was one of these typical announcements of an investment that had been made of $300 million in the small town of Hometown, Pennsylvania, population
Hmm.
3,500. And this was an investment in a factory that makes crucial parts for computer chips. And so $300 million, it would create 200 skilled manufacturing jobs. Now, that's not the kind of investment or job that you would see pop up in Hometown, Pennsylvania, which is like
Yeah.
far from any major urban center. So it caught my eye, and I did a little digging, and I found two things. One of them is that Hometown, PA, was founded in the 1800s by German immigrants, and I was like, okay, kind of interesting, um, you know. But the reason that caught my eye is because I also learned that the company that made this investment is called EMD Electronics, and it's a subsidiary of a German corporation. It's owned by a company called Merck from Germany. And you're probably wondering, okay, you've lost me. What does the fact that Hometown was founded by Germans have to do with the fact that it's getting investment from a German company?
Hmm.
And my point is, the evidence tells us it has everything to do because where immigrants arrive, companies from their home countries invest,
Wow.
and they do so for even centuries later. So it's not a coincidence that a place settled by Germans is getting investment by a German corporation. It's not a coincidence that a lot of the investment we're getting in the US today comes from companies from India, from China, from Mexico, because those are some of the big immigrant sending countries into the US. Why? Because immigrants create these networks of information and trust that make it easier for businesses to invest across borders.
Hmm.
And just like that example of EMD Electronics, those investments create jobs, and they create jobs for native born people. And so, whether it's recent immigrants or ancestral immigrants, you can be assured that immigrants are going to create these corridors of business and investment that are really good for job creation, right? And like nobody has thought about that.
Hmm.
Nobody has thought about immigrants and investment that way.
Wow. Yeah, goodness. Yeah, the whole question of economic impact and the way you explore that, I mean, that's been extraordinary to me. But then also the fact, I know one of the claims that kind of hit me in the face earliest is, the idea that people are actually safer with more immigration rather than less. That's decidedly not in the water right now. So I'd love for you to speak to that as well, like the claim that people are actually safer with more immigration.
Yeah, yeah. Again, right? Uh, I mean, talk about something that gets repeated over and over. People really believe somehow it's in the water, as you said, that people believe that immigrants bring crime, right? Or that
Mm,
undocumented immigrants in particular are coming across the border and committing crime. So but actually the data shows exactly the opposite. Like you said, that
mm,
actually we're safer with more immigration. There's a few angles to that. The first one is that actually immigrants are the group of people in the US with the lowest crime rate.
mm,
Okay. And whether you look at the national level or you look at state by state statistics, immigrants commit fewer violent crimes, property crimes, drug crimes. It even needs to be said in this election cycle, crimes against animals, right? Dogs and
mm,
cats, right? Immigrants really have the lowest crime rate in America. And undocumented immigrants commit even fewer crimes than immigrants who are here legally, okay?
mm.
Which is exactly the opposite of the political narrative. And you might think, well, why is that the case? Well, for undocumented immigrants, in part is that they have a very strong reason not to be on the wrong side of the law, right? They
Yeah.
know that if they get caught in a crime, they're going to be deported. So they have a very strong incentive not to commit crimes. But every immigrant has a lower crime rate than native born people. In fact, when you look at data of what happens to communities when immigrants arrive,
Mm,
crime either goes down or it stays the same. It never goes up. So literally, your community is safer with more immigrants rather than less, just because native-born people have a higher crime rate.
mm,
Um, but there's an even deeper angle to this, and it's the following. Um, when you think about safety, particularly national security, um, our national security depends on us being able to stay ahead of our geopolitical rivals, right? So
mm.
I'll give you a silly example from a movie that was popular last year. Now, Oppenheimer, right, kind of was all about the atomic bomb. And
Yeah.
look, the atomic bombing is very controversial. I'm not saying the atomic bomb was like it was, I'm not saying it was a good thing to bomb Japan. But what I am saying is this was a very important national security issue during World War II.
Yeah.
And the only reason that America was able to out innovate the Nazis and beat them to the production of the atomic bomb, which they would have used in terrible ways, was because the US got a wave of immigrants from
Mm,
Europe who became the essence of the Manhattan Project. Without
mm,
immigrants, we don't have the Manhattan Project. We don't beat, in this case, the Germans. The space race. Without immigrants, we do not put a man on the moon. Absolutely
mm,
not. Just go look it up. Go see all the
mm,
immigrants that were involved in the space race. Today, we are competing against geopolitical rivals in 5G technology and AI, in
mm,
weapon systems. Well, it turns out that immigrants disproportionately fill jobs and patent in areas that have national security implications. And so if you kick immigrants out or keep them out, we lose out on innovative talent
mm,
that produces all these technologies that keep us safer. Also, our military um, depends very significantly on immigrants to fill a lot of positions, right? A lot of military recruits are foreign-born people, and so without immigrations, like literally, you would be less safe, right?
mm.
Because our geopolitical rivals would out innovate us in areas of national security. So whether it's everyday crime in your neighborhood or national security kind of stuff, we depend on immigrants to keep us safer.
Yeah. Wow. And yet, so I always try to think in terms of with any kind of argument, anticipating what people are going to say. And I feel like so much of what gets circulated are largely anecdotes. Anecdotes are kind of so. What happened if we were doing a lecture right now and this is a Q&A and someone says like, "Oh yeah, I hear the numbers," but then they say, "How about?" and they insert a story.
Sure.
How do you respond to the anecdotes that I feel like people often weaponize when they are confronted with overwhelming data?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the emblematic of this is the political ads, right? You
Yeah.
know, grainy picture of a quote illegal immigrant, right? And you know it says, oh, so and so crossed the border illegally, they raped someone and they killed them, and it's a terrible story, right? And
Sure.
it brings all of us down. But then from that story, which is true, that happens. There are immigrants, of course, that commit crimes, just like there's people in any group that commit
Right.
crimes. The generalization that therefore most immigrants commit crimes, all immigrants commit crimes, immigrants are increasing crime, right? So that's a false
Mm.
generalization from an anecdote, right?
Mm.
That would be like me saying, I had a friend, um, I I had a friend in high school who was Mexican, right? That friend was caught for drugs. All Mexicans are drug dealers. It's
Mm.
like we got to be smarter than that, right? and,
Mm.
and and the data tells us the opposite. In fact, the data tells us that immigrants are much less likely to commit crime. So how would I respond to that? I would say absolutely, it's true
Mm.
that that case happened. It's terrible, right? And I feel horrible for the victims. I'm not saying that it's a good thing that happened, but I also am saying that we are worse off by keeping immigrants out,
Yeah.
right? You will be less safe. That is the very thing that you fear in that example is more likely to happen because of the policy decision you make. So I think we have to separate anecdotes
Mm.
from what's generalizable on average from what good policy decisions are that would make us all better off,
Mm.
right? Here's another example. Someone to say, oh, my brother worked in the construction industry. He lost a job to an undocumented immigrant in the construction industry. I have no way to question whether that's true. But even
Sure.
if we grant that that's true, actually, on average, immigrants create jobs for native-born workers,
Mm.
including undocumented immigrants. So if you want more construction jobs, you need more immigrants rather than
Yeah.
fewer, because without the immigrants that do those construction jobs, the construction firm would shut down. It wouldn't have enough workers,
Mm.
right? So your brother who works in construction would be more likely to lose the job rather than less. Um, so I think we address these negative things on a case by case basis, right? If an immigrant commits a crime, they should be prosecuted and probably deported if the crime is serious enough,
Mm.
right? If one person loses a job to an immigrant, they should have unemployment insurance and we should help that person get back on their feet. But that again, that does not mean that the logical conclusion then is that we keep or kick all immigrants out, because that would be worse.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Professor. It's interesting as you and I know these are how these conversations actually work on the ground in terms of I hear you kind of moving in and out, understandably, of sort of addressing immigrants who are legal, but then also who are undocumented. How much in these conversations does that muddy the waters? Do you often find yourself kind of wanting to sort of separate those conversations and treat them differently, or it is more helpful? Because I do feel like even conversations I have with folks, they kind of go in and out
Yeah.
of stories, situations, questions that really are referring more to legal immigrants or other folks who are undocumented. So to what extent is that a separate conversation, if at all?
No, I mean, I think we should talk about them together, right? But I think we should also, well, anyway, it's a big issue. Let's talk about a few things. Again, let me first give you the headline. When I said immigrants bring those big five things,
Yeah.
right? That's true regardless of how immigrants arrive, whether they
Mm.
arrived as refugees, asylees, economic migrants, legal or illegally. That's true, right? Undocumented immigrants bring all those five things. That is, they bring their talent, they attract investment, they pay taxes, they consume, and many of them introduce innovations, right? Whether they're technical innovations or other innovations or just new products and services, all immigrants bring those five things. So the economy, in some ways, is an economy. The economy is this impersonal beast that doesn't care how you arrived, right? It
Sure.
just cares what you're putting in. Now, am I saying that it's right that we have a quarter of all immigrants in this country living here without authorization? Am I saying that it's right that there's chaos at the border? Absolutely, I'm not saying
Mm.
that. But I think it helps us to know if if these people are needed and are contributing to their economy versus not, because the policy decision we would make is very different. So the question is not whether it's good or bad that we have a lot of undocumented immigrants, because obviously we would want all immigrants to be here legally. I think the real question is why?
Mm.
Why do you have a quarter of all immigrants, that's about 12 million people in this country, living here without authorization? And you
Mm-hmm.
can't tell me that it's just a few bad apples crossing the border. When a quarter of our apples are here without legal authorization, we
Yeah.
have a bad system for bringing apples in. That's kind of my
Mm.
point. And I'll give you an example. The last time I think here was where most people just don't quite understand how our immigration system works and when was the last time we updated it. So the last time we updated our immigration laws, that is the number and the types of visas we give. Okay,
Mm.
we've made other tiny updates, but in terms of the number and the types of visas we give was 1990.
Mm.
Okay, now I don't know how old you are. I was alive in 1990, but the world was really different than it is today, right?
Yeah.
Like this meeting we're having, impossible, right? Because there
Sure.
was no internet, right? So just think about how different our economy was, right? Think about how different our demographic profile was. Like we didn't have an aging population and our birth rates
Right.
were above the replacement rate. Think about how different our geopolitical environment was. We had just come out of the Cold War with the USSR,
Yeah.
right? We weren't like fighting a trade war with China or, anyway. So I mean, everything has changed since 1990 except the number and types of visas we give. Our economy was $9 trillion back then. Today it's
Mm.
$25 trillion. So it's more than doubled in size. So we have a constant number of visas. The economy is growing by leaps and bounds. The world is changing. So you see the discrepancy between what the immigration system allowed back in 1990
Yeah.
and what it allows now is so large, right? And so, um, and so that gap between what our system allows and what our country needs gets filled dysfunctionally by
Mm.
illegal immigration. I'll give you some anecdotes to make this more tangible. Do you know in our system we give 1 million green cards per year? Okay,
Mm.
out of those we only give 140,000 for employment purposes.
Wow.
100 now. Your state, I think you live in Indiana, right? You
That's right.
mentioned the state of Indiana by itself could probably use all 140,000 of those.
Mm.
Okay? Out of those 140,000, do you know how many go to people without a college degree? 5,000, right?
Wow.
Again, my neighborhood could, well, I'm exaggerating, but certainly my city, certainly Philadelphia, where I live, could use all 5,000 of those people without a college degree to
Yeah.
fill jobs in landscaping, in restaurants, in home care, etc. Okay, an Indian who has a master's degree, who's
Mm.
trying to come in on an employment-based visa, category 2, has to wait in line 195 years
Oof.
for a green card. Okay, if a farmer needs to hire a year-round farm worker and can't find one among the native labor force, which they can't, do you know how many green cards there are for year-round farm workers?
Mm.
0. Do you know
Wow.
how many visas there are for plumbers? 0. Do you know how many visas there are? So do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
We have a system that's so
Mm.
decrepit that what happens? When you can't fill those essential needs, you're going to get irregular immigration trying to fill it. Am I saying
Mm.
it's the right thing to do? No. But the fix for illegal immigration is not to just enforce that outdated 1990 system
Mm.
because you're just creating more pressure, right? It's like trying to plug a water leak with your thumb. You have to have a bigger water pipe,
Yeah.
right? Just change the water pipe, make it bigger. That is, increase the amount and variety of visas so that all those ridiculous unfilled needs get filled. So I know I'm being a little long-winded in
Mm.
my answer,
Not at
but
all.
I feel it's very important for people to understand that the main reason, the main culprit of illegal immigration is that we haven't updated the system to make it match
Mm.
reality. That's really why it's happening.
Mm.
There are other things happening too, but they're tiny compared to that big explanation.
When you get into the brokenness, the fundamental brokenness of the system, and knowing, and one of the things I love about your approach in general, and you say, and I feel like this bears out, how nonpartisan it is, especially insofar that data, numbers, the research, it just kind of is what it is. But I think for a lot of folks, it's so complicated right now, especially navigating just all the ways that we project these onto our partisan system. How often I will hear, well, where we are is the fault of this particular president or that president. The generalizations, everything from people, we've heard a lot on the right language of open borders that I don't think is exactly fair. But I will say, like now, one of the things I find interesting is how often I'll hear people on the left easily concede kind of the same narratives about immigrants just as often, like, oh yeah, well, like this is a deep problem, and kind of repeating this, just the same kind of stories that we hear on the right. So I guess especially when we think about how broken the system is and how do we address that and fix that, how do we even begin to kind of parse through the highly partisan narratives that we're immersed in to get towards something like the truth and how people can work together to change that system?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is where I need to be a little humble, right? Because you're asking me a question of how do we overcome political partisanship and contention at the national level. I don't know that I know the answer to that completely. I think that there is no one answer. It's probably a lot of little things, but at least I can give you my opinion on this, right? So far, pretty much everything I've said is based on evidence and data. Here, I'm going to give you a little bit of my opinion, but it's informed by the evidence. I would go back to the villain victim narrative, right? What's happened is that you have now a party that I think it's fair to say, I'm a political independent, by the way, right? I think I can kind of fairly attack both sides here.
Yeah.
But you have a party, in this case, the Republican Party, that has very much adopted the villain narrative, right? Immigrants are rapists. We have to have mass deportations, right? The idea that immigrants are really bad for us. And then there's some qualifications of, well, legal immigration versus not, but it's very much a villain narrative. But interestingly, the other side, like you said, has kind of moved and kind of accepted the premise. And that's because the other side doesn't have a good comeback to that, right? It's either villain or victim, right? It's like, so what do you hear Kamala Harris say? She's talking about it in terms of enforcement, right? Which is a little bit more of a villain type framing. And then she says kind of a vague statement like, and we should be true to our what our heritage as a nation of immigrants, which is a little bit the nostalgic kind of immigrants as victims type thinking. But notice that no side is articulating a positive, good for us message.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what we need to go to, because again, if you make it about pity or fear wins, right? I think, and let me say one more thing. Fear gets you to a minority, a large minority, but not a majority. Pity gets you a tiny minority, never gets you to a majority. But self-interest gets us to a majority. And what the evidence is saying, what we've been talking about during this conversation, is that immigrants are good for us. That's a self-interested argument, right? And I think once we appeal to self-interest, we get to a majority, right? Because then it's win-win, right? Then we don't have to say, well, we let these people in at our expense. And then it's like, oh, is it the right thing to do or not? We say, no, we let these people in. It's good for us. There will be a bigger economy, a more diversified economy, a more vibrant culture, more jobs for my children and grandchildren. And so what I'm getting at in terms of answering is, I think that we need to get to the point where we talk about immigration in terms of self-interest, national self-interest.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that we're going to get there. I'm not optimistic in the next 5 to 10 years, but I think in, let's say, maybe 20 years. And here's why. Our demographic profile is terrible, right? We are aging and dying, right? Yeah. We're not having enough people replace it. Like we don't have enough nurses, doctors. We don't have enough people to build our houses. We just need people so desperately, when you look at it objectively, that I think at some point, out of sheer self-interest, we're going to realize we either accept immigrants or we become Japan or we become South Korea.
Yeah.
Right. And not only that, we'll be competing with Japan and South Korea and the UK and, all the major industrialized countries for those people. So that will kind of add fuel to the fire of self-interest. I think that's how we're going to get there. But I don't think it's going to be anytime really soon. I think that's more of a medium to long-term thing.
That's so helpful, this framing. And I think, again, I mean, over the years, I've done a lot of work with the One campaign and thinking about how, like, even in that quarter, I feel like so much of the narrative shift had to be, because a lot of it, getting folks in Africa, antiretroviral drugs, having to reframe it in terms of like, hey, we're not talking about charity, having to show people ultimately how doing these things it's not just good for the world, good for America, but that the whole lens then of self-interest, I feel like is so exciting to me, just in terms of the capacity, hopefully, for people to be able to see, no, this isn't just good for, again, in that sort of the victim narrative, but this actually is good for America, good for everybody, good for the world. I did want to ask you, if this is not too granular of a question, I legitimately don't know how you'd address this. So if, knowing this has come up a lot this election cycle in different ways, but that there was a bipartisan bill proposed, James Langford from Oklahoma, where I've moved here most recently, that largely had support, famously or infamously, former President Trump kind of pushed that away, feeling like it, didn't want a perceived win for the Biden administration. I'm curious if, and I don't know that that's the case, but if whoever wins, if there's traction again for that bipartisan package to go through, does it really address the kind of systemic issues that you raise? Like, is that even there in the framework?
No, unfortunately not, right? Here's what's interesting, and again, it's evidence of the Democrats essentially kind of conceding the premise, right, of the current. I say current because Republicans historically have been in favor of immigration during certain periods, but of the current Republican view. So no, and the reason it doesn't address the systemic issues is because it's very explicitly a border security bill only, or a border management bill only, right? And so, by the way, I was not against the bill. I thought it was better than nothing.
Sure.
Some might listen to me and think, oh, you're sort of a, open borders extremist. I'm not. I actually think enforcement is a very important part of any good immigration system. But what you enforce has to make sense. Again, if you're enforcing a law, right, that only gives us 5,000 employment-based green cards for people without college degrees, or that has no visas for farm workers, no visas for plumbers, that makes Indians wait 195 years in line, you're just enforcing. Again, it's like you're putting your thumb, or maybe now the bill says, okay, we can put our thumb and the rest of our hand around the leaky pipe, but you're not changing the pipe to a bigger pipe, if that makes sense. And so here's my worry with that. And I would have been in support of it. I think it was better than nothing. Is that the bill? It increased the number of visas by a little bit, I think by like 7 to 10%, but we need to more than double or triple it. So it was like the new pipe wasn't big enough, in my analogy. But if you just enforce a law that makes no sense, the law can create incentives for even more problems, right? It's a little bit like saying, okay, our speed limit on the biggest highway in the country was 20 miles an hour, way too low, right?
Yeah.
Now we're going to make it 25 miles an hour. And we're now going to enforce the heck out of that. Well, you still know there's going to be a ton of speeding, right? If it's the biggest highway in the country, just because for a variety of reasons, people need to get to where they need to get. And so no, I think the short answer is not. Now, I think as a political compromise that maybe would open the door for more reform, I would be okay with that. But I kind of doubt that the other side would have then allowed more reform. They would have said, fine, we did it. Now we're going to enforce this. So I think you need to, again, do the comprehensive reform. And by the way, you don't need to do it all at once. So for example, let's say that the question of granting amnesty to the 12 million immigrants who are here without authorization, well, you don't have to pair that with the bill, right? You could start with things like, all right, well, look, let's start by at least making more visas available for situations that make sense. And we'll kind of we'll separate the amnesty thing, right? And deal with it separately. So you don't have to solve it all at once, but you have to allow more people in, or if not, that pipe will keep, leaks will show up in other sides.
So if for people, especially right now, I think it's on everybody's mind, who want to engage civically in a responsible way, if both sides, as it were right now, kind of accept the same fundamental premise and nobody really has a constructive proposal that's widely circulated that really does address these issues, for people who hear this and kind of say, well, then what do I do? What would you say to us if especially in the mainstream of American politics right now, that option really isn't one that's on the table?
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. I would say, let me turn to something a little more hopeful, which I think is a good way to start answering your question. This dysfunction exists at the federal political level, right? It's really Congress that is completely stuck in this. But I've actually spent the last several months, especially since the launch of the book, but even before then, engaging with a lot of local groups. So think of like city level, state level, even like city council or local chamber of commerce level organizations. And at that level, they get it, and there's a lot of bipartisan agreement. And that's because at that level, you can't just talk; you have to solve real issues, right?
Yeah.
So a mayor, right, when they say, oh, this factory down the road is about to close because we don't have enough workers, they have to solve that. And they realize, well, the only way we're going to do that is we have to let immigrants in, right? Or when the city council realizes this neighborhood is becoming blighted because it's depopulated, and look, we have a bunch of African refugees that could fill it, they're going to take them, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So at the local level, I actually see a lot of both Democrat and Republican agreement, like 90% agreement. There's still some points of disagreement, mostly around issues of undocumented immigrants, but they tend to be very tiny. It's kind of surprising how much agreement there is. So I think the hopeful thing is, what I would tell your listeners is get involved at the local level. Get involved in your chamber of commerce, your city, even at the state level. And that will push federal politicians to change. We actually saw a good example of that in this election. During the whole thing about Springfield, Ohio, right? The Haitians eating cats and dogs. I thought it was extremely telling that at great political risk to their careers, the Republican governor of Ohio, the Republican mayor of Springfield, and the people of Springfield who tend to be Republicans, all rose up and pushed back and said, no, we need these Haitians. They've helped fill jobs. They've helped prevent our factories from closing. They're paying taxes. They're consuming. They're repopulating a town that was depopulating. And so do you see that the local level perception is very different? And so I would say get involved at the local level, and then your federal politicians will hear the message, right? Because then when they propose a bill for mass deporting 11 million people or 12 million people, but the Chamber of Commerce they represent says, no, foul, because we're losing 10,000 taxpayers and 10,000 workers, politicians will listen to that. That would be my call to action, is do it at the local level.
I love this tiny pivot to hope. For one, considering the kind of intersections we explore on the podcast, hope for me is still such a fundamentally spiritual word that gets to motivation, that gets to intention. I found myself saying a lot right now to people of faith, some version of that really all hope is local, which for me,
great phrase.
Well, just as a person who's a Christian, just even the idea of this foundation of, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, like what really happens on the ground, real people, real communities, that this is how we change the world. I'm curious as to kind of in your analysis and what you're kind of seeing on the ground now, what role you see for people of faith, where maybe sometimes communities of faith have been helpful or maybe not so helpful in this conversation, or for people who, from a faith-based perspective, we want to gauge this more robustly. Where do you see faith in this whole conversation?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. I am a person of faith. I'm a Christian. And I see faith in a lot of different ways. For one, look, I talk about, as an academic, right? As a scholar, I talk about the benefits of immigration. I use my fingers, right? I give you statistics. But often where the rubber meets the road, that is in taking newcomers, welcoming them, and getting them on their feet to help them make those contributions they make, faith organizations play a disproportionate role in that. I can't tell you the number of churches or church, or religion, organizations sponsored or by a religious faith, whether it's Christian or Muslim or of any background. They are the ones, I think, because every religion shares the basic tenet of I was a stranger and you took me in, right? That's the Christian version, but there are Muslim, Buddhist, Hindi, right? Every religion has a version of that tenet. And so I think it's no surprise that religious organizations are the ones who take these newcomers and help them initially. And by the way, they very, very quickly get on their feet. We're not talking about years and years of support. We're talking about several months, maybe a couple years. but very quickly these people are on their feet, and then they're bringing all those contributions. So I would say faith organizations, because of that belief in welcoming the stranger, or loving their neighbor, play a pivotal role. That's maybe a sociological answer, right? These are organizations that make it happen. Much more than an individual personal answer. And here I'm speaking very personal. I'm removing my scholar hat, right? Here I'm just speaking as an individual of faith. I believe very deeply, right, that at the end, when I am judged, right, and I meet the good Lord, one of the first questions he's going to ask me is, how did you treat other people?
Yeah.
And how did you treat particularly the outcast, the outsider, and the stranger, right? Because that's really the test, right? That's really the test. It's not how did I meet people that I naturally liked, right? Not how did I treat people who, employed me and paid me, and, it was in my self-interest to treat right. But how did I treat the outsider? And so I think there is no controversy among anyone of faith, regardless of background, that is really important. Now, thankfully, we can have our moral cake and eat it too. That is, doing the right thing for others turns out to be good for us, because again, people are people and they contribute those things. So thankfully, there's not so the last statement I'll make is, if you're a person of faith, be careful of falling prey to the victim mindset. Right? Because often I think the mistake that we of faith do make is that we're the main proponents of the victim mindset.
Absolutely.
Right? Because it's true. I mean, to be clear, what I mean by the victim mindset, it's true that sometimes there are immigrants who come in as very needy, right? The Venezuelan family who is desperately fleeing oppression, sure, they're victims and they're needy for a period of time. But let's be careful as people of faith to see them as permanent victims. Very quickly, these people will be net positive contributors. And so I think that when I said earlier we need to appeal to self-interest, that is not contradictory to what we believe in our faith. Our faith is good and it helps us help those people. But let's be careful not to, perhaps out of good intentions, undermine the self-interest that I think is more politically effective and good for us in the long run.
That's such a needed word on so many levels. I mean, for one, I can't agree more that for all the things about faith, because there are a lot of questions that really are not as clear as people will make them out to be. But I feel like if there's anything in Hebrew Bible, Jewish scripture, Christian text, as you say, on through doing the interfaith work that I'm doing now, so much with my Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist friends, they all thunder so clearly in terms of some version of the idea that how you respond to refugees, how you respond to immigrants, is directly correlative with how you respond to God. To love God is to love your neighbor. Whatever is happening this way has everything to do with how you relate this way. And it's just there's such clarity for me on these issues, even within these sacred texts, where there are all kinds of other things that people might disagree about. When you talk about hope in this way, and it's one of the things I love and find even so interesting about your approach, is that, because I know that in terms of the narratives that we hear and the ways that the two-party structure is largely just so broken in terms of a capacity right now to address these systemic issues in a way that even feels like coherent, it would make sense to me if the edge of the book or the talks that you give were super apocalyptic about it, in terms of like, this is just so awful and so dark and so dire that people say these things. And of course you confront the lies. But it's interesting how I feel like the tone of everything you're doing does feel very upbeat. It's like in the same way that the word gospel means good news. It almost feels like, hey, here's good news about immigration. Here's good news about refugees, maybe good news that you've not heard. But it's very much a minority report, to be sure. So how do you stay hopeful in the face of so much disinformation? Even to say like that in 5 or 10 years, to even envision or imagine a constructive future. How do you stay hopeful in the midst of so many lies that are told?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Nobody's ever asked me that before, so I really appreciate that. I have to do some self-reflection. And you're right, this is a hopeful, I mean, the book is kind of up there, right, on the screen. When we were choosing the cover, we made a very deliberate choice about the imagery and the coloring. right? Notice that a lot of nonfiction books that tend to be fact based, they have a white, color monochrome. But I remember having this conversation, and as the author ultimately deciding, it's very important that we have a happy, colorful cover, right? Because immigration
Mm.
is often such a dour, contentious thing. And I really am trying to say there is good news. Now, please, far be it from me to like say this is gospel type good news,
Sure.
but this is empirical good news. This is empirically speaking
Yeah, yeah,
fantastic news, right?
yeah.
It's a win-win. And so, yeah, I think that was the main motivation for writing the book, is that
Mm.
nobody was saying that, right? You know, am I delusional enough to believe that I'm going to change the conversation single-handedly? No, I'm
Mm.
trying to do my bit, right? And I'm hopeful that I can help some people. But part of how I stay hopeful is like one is I feel like I have the facts on my side, right?
Yeah.
Now, could evidence supersede what I have? Perhaps, and I would be the first
Mm.
to say, well, as an academic, now I have to, change my position on this. But I have the facts on my side. So
Yeah.
when someone hatefully says these immigrants are going to rape your daughter, I
Mm.
can say, no, look, I have facts on my side, right? I don't have to be afraid of saying that because I have facts on my side. When someone says immigrants are stealing jobs, I can say, no, the facts tell you the opposite. They're creating
Mm.
jobs. So I think having the facts on my side gives me comfort. It gives me confidence.
Mm.
And I think, if I'm honest, I'm not always hopeful. I mean,
Sure.
you know, uh, last Friday I went home pretty disillusioned, feeling like, gosh, I'm working so hard to try to share this message, and it doesn't always seem to resonate. But I think that any um, I think that anything we do at the end of the day is going to be hard if it's worthwhile, right? The
Yeah.
most important things I've done in my life, like having a family, are also the hardest.
Mm.
And so, I feel like this is a long-term game that I'm playing. Um, and I'm not the one being judged here, if that makes
Right.
sense,
Right.
right? It's we're all being judged collectively. Um, and then finally, perhaps again, because I believe that self-interest ends up being more effective
Yes.
in populations than pity, I really do see us getting to the self-interest point. So I actually draw
Mm.
hope from that.
Mm.
I don't think that we're going to improve our immigration system out of compassion for Venezuelans. We're going to
Yeah.
do it because we realize our country is really going to decline if we don't get our act together. And
Mm.
so that also makes it so that I don't have to act like a charity. I can tell you this is good for you, and I have more confidence that human nature will respond to that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and there's something fundamentally American about that. It's like, yeah, if you want to build a great economy, you want to build this. Like, there's something, yeah, the idea that self-interest will prevail does seem like a very American kind of bet. Maybe there's that idea of America. And I so want to respect your time. I'm wondering because I do think okay, I'm sure you get pushback, but I also feel like again the kind of work that you do with the data, I can't imagine there's only so much you can say after somebody gets through an initial like kind of the memes or the anecdotes or whatever. But knowing that most people out there, hopefully, I hope folks will read the books, but then they're going to continue on Facebook or wherever. They're going to continue to be confronted with stories. What would you tell people in terms of how they might just think a little bit more critically, how they might evaluate the information that they get, that they hear, stories that people tell, but especially like in a digital age? How would you encourage people, maybe beyond reading the book, in terms of what they can do to maybe just ask some more critical questions and to know how to even be able to again to sift and sort things, especially when they might come from sources that they trust? Well, this is my neighbor. I know he's a good guy, and they shared it on their wall. Like, what do you? How do people begin to sort the fact from the fiction in that way?
Yeah, well, and this goes so much beyond immigration, right? I mean, we can talk about vaccines. We can talk about
Yes.
like, so many issues. Look, I would say in some ways this is perhaps selfish, but that's why I wrote the book, right? I wrote
Mm.
the book to give you the data. If on my website, zekehernandez.net, I have many pages that I call deep dives on all the issues. So if you literally, like, if you still have time before the election and you want to deep dive into the immigration and crime thing or the immigrants and jobs thing, and these deep dives aren't just me talking. They're actually, I'm sharing the original source of data, the original research, and you can go read it for yourself. So I would say, some of it is think a little bit like a scientist. I don't mean that you need a PhD, but like there is like, it's about evaluating where claims come from, right?
Yeah.
I mean, your neighbor might be a wonderful person, right? Your neighbor might be even a really moral person. They might be really good at what they do. But if they're not an expert on immigration, like, why would they be the source of your belief in something about immigration, right? Most journalists aren't either, right? Journalists are reporting what politicians say, but like, just because it was on ABC or Fox News, like, why would you give that any credence? And so I think that it's good to pay attention, listen to, but then treat it as a hypothesis, right? So so think like a scientist, right? Instead of taking the assertion or the statement for granted, treat it as a hypothesis. Is it true that, fill in the blank, whatever claim you heard, and then go find sources. I mean, I have tried to make the book and other resources available, but also ask yourself other questions. What is the motivation of this person? Does this person have the requisite expertise? How long have they been studying it, right? And even, I would say, be careful of academics. Right? Because an academic might be an expert on one issue, but not another, right? So if you come to me on some, I don't know, let's pick another controversial topic, global warming, right? You shouldn't believe my claims about global warming. That's just not what I research. But I think, you can look at my track record studying immigration and come to your conclusions. But I think I'm more credible on that issue, the issue of immigration, than global warming. And so I think it's just, be a little bit scientific about these issues. And I don't know of another way to say that, right? But social media is really not a good place to find facts.
Absolutely,
it's just not.
And especially there's a demographic that's kind of outside your own, a community that's not outside your own. How much easier, just in terms of how our brains are wired, even to believe this information about people that we don't know or we might not be in immediate proximity to. It just seems like such a
And sorry, I apologize for interrupting you, but that's
please.
really important. Because the other thing I was going to say is immigration is one of those things where just open your eyes and look around where you live. Like, literally, just open your eyes and look around where you live, right? Like, is your neighborhood, is your state falling apart because of immigrant crime? I mean, if you actually look, it's not. Right? Like, you can see it with your own eyes. Right? It's not. Open your eyes and pay attention to. Go to a neighborhood where a lot of immigrants have arrived. And like, does that mean that everyone that used to live there is unemployed? You'll see that they're not. Why? Because the economy is bigger, right? There's now more people that need goods and services, so there's more work to go around for everybody. So I think this is where just, besides being or maybe as part of being scientific, go make your own observations. It's interesting because now I'm going back to research, but research does show that when people are exposed to immigrants, when they live next to immigrants, they actually have very favorable opinions of them. Right? It's the people who aren't that have the negative opinions. So it's literally fear of the unknown, right? So that's why I would say just go look with your own eyes, and the people who do come out on the positive side.
It's interesting how much I feel like we continue to circle around that sort of all hope is local kind of idea, because at the end of the day, knowing real people and real communities on the ground, what's happening in your state, what's happening in your county, what's happening in your town, how we engage that. It is interesting how consistently it just feels like there's so much more room for real hope, change, growth, development in those spaces than there might be. And I think it helps too, because with the paralysis of sometimes it's like, well, how am I going to sort these national issues? Well, probably I am not, but there is something I can do in terms of my own community and where and how I engage, or even in my own Facebook wall, what I choose to share or not share, all of those things. Like there actually are things that we can do. I promise I'm not looking for a particular answer here, but knowing like if anybody by chance were to hear this before going to the polls, when we acknowledge, for example, like that, without trying to tell people exactly how to vote, but when we acknowledge, that there is a lot of systemic brokenness and ways that the two-party system aren't addressing some of these things constructively, what counsel would you give somebody who's saying like, yeah, okay, but I'm still voting in a national election. I'm still trying to in terms of just how they kind of sort that particular kind of civic responsibility in a moment like this. Any counsel that you would give?
Yeah, well, first I would say vote. Actually vote. Don't sit out.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's also with issues that are confusing like this. It's very easy to kind of throw your hands up and say, I don't know. Who am I? Right? And by the way, why does my vote matter? Right? So vote. Right? Don't sit it out. And then I would say, I go back to part of your previous answer, right? Or sorry, my answer to your previous question, which is, go find the more scientific, fact-based sources, but then ask yourself, if we implemented what this candidate is saying, how would my children's life look like? Right? How would my grandchildren's life look like? And in this case, and again, I know that many people aren't voting just on immigration, although it's actually kind of the issue that it's one of the 2 or 3 main issues.
Absolutely.
Right. But anyway, but on the issue of immigration, right, I see one candidate in this case who is saying, look, we're gonna kick out and keep out millions and millions and millions of people who are bringing these 5 things that I need for the economic prosperity of my children and grandchildren, who do not undermine public safety, who actually create it. I think on the issue of immigration, the choice is pretty clear in this case. Yeah. Now, you might have other reasons to vote for that candidate that are not about immigration, and we could have a reasonable conversation about that. But I think in this case on immigration, the choice is pretty clear. Having said that, the other candidate has not presented a very constructive vision on immigration either, right? Right. Other than I'm going to pass this border security bill. So I'm not too happy with either side.
Sure.
But I think this is one case where one side is presenting policies that will be a lot more damaging than the other side when it comes to immigration. But again, you don't have to take my word for it. Go look at the data and the resources I mentioned.
Well, but it's so helpful, just that sense that there's not a reasonable way to scapegoat all of your existential problems on a group of people irrationally. It's just not there. And I love that. I just can't say enough for folks about the book. I'm going to continue to be evangelistic about it and try to get it in me, because knowing that whatever happens the next few days and or weeks, however long this takes, that none of this is going away, and how much we need for individuals and for faith communities to engage on a deeper level. So I just can't thank you enough for your time and for this resource and for being out there the way that you are, getting this message out there. It's so important, and it makes me feel so much more hopeful in a time that can feel dire in a whole lot of ways. So thank you so much for your work and for your witness.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's really a pleasure, and thank you for what you're doing. Really, thanks for all the listeners too.
That's so kind. I just have to say, but I tried so hard to wrap up, but I love the fact, because I feel like not everybody does this, just how much at every turn you say, and even on your website, in all of your research, hey, here's the data. Please research this for yourself. Please check it out. And I just think that's worth noting, that a lot of folks who speak with a kind of authority in their voice about things aren't really actively encouraging people. Please search this out for yourself, and putting that much confidence in terms of here's the data. You can read it. Please do that. I just think that says a lot to me.
Yeah, thanks. Like I said, I'm not under judgment. It's the data that's under judgment, right? Yeah. So that's part of how I stay calm here. But yeah, anyway, thank you again. Really, so nice to meet you. And I really do mean it when I thank you for what you do. You're helping a lot of people.
So appreciate it, Professor Hernandez, and we will definitely do this again, hopefully before too long. So
okay, that would be
great. Take care.
Take care.